For over 30 years, a woman kept a secret that could shatter the image of a respected religious leader. And when she tried to speak out, they called her crazy, rebellious, even possessed by the devil. But today, at 67, she breaks the silence. And what you're about to hear may forever change how you see faith. If I tell you this story, you might never see certain people the same way again. You know that feeling when you believe in something so deeply that you give your entire life, your family, your dreams, everything, only to discover you were living a lie? A lie so deep that when you try to speak the truth, they call you crazy, rebellious, or possessed by the devil. Hello, my dear friends. My name is Evelyn, but you can call me Miss Evie. I'm 67 years old, born in Cedar Falls, Iowa in 1958. Today, I want to share with you a story I've kept buried in my heart for over 30 years. A story about faith, about painful discoveries, and about how sometimes the very people who claim to speak for God are the ones who stray furthest from Him. Before I begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching this video? Please leave it in the comments below. I love knowing that my voice is reaching so many different corners of our beautiful country. And if you can, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. It helps this old lady here continue telling her stories. The story I'm about to tell happened when I was just a teenager, but it shaped the woman I became. It was during the mid-1970s, and I was a Seventh-day Adventist. I thought I had found the absolute truth, that I was part of God's chosen people. Little did I know that behind the walls of our church sanctuary, secrets were hidden that would make me question everything I believed. The irony is, I was eventually expelled for doing exactly what they had always preached, reading the Bible and seeking the truth. It was 1965 when my parents first brought me to the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Cedar Falls. I was only 7 years old, a little girl with blonde pigtails and scuffed Mary Jane shoes, clutching my mother's hand as we walked up those white wooden steps every Saturday morning. The church building was modest but well kept, with tall windows that caught the Iowa sunlight and made it dance across the polished pews. It always smelled of old wood polish and the lilacs my mother brought from our garden. My father, Robert, worked at the John Deere factory. He had strong, calloused hands that he would fold reverently during prayer, and he never missed a Sabbath service, no matter how tired he was from the week's work. My mother, Dorothy, was a seamstress who made our Sunday dresses, though of course we called them our Sabbath dresses. She had a voice like honey when she sang hymns, and she knew every verse by heart. We were what they called a faithful family. We observed the Sabbath from Friday evening to Saturday evening. No work, no cooking, no worldly entertainment. We ate cold meals prepared the day before, read religious books, and attended both morning and afternoon services. Our home reflected our beliefs. No television on Saturdays, no radio playing anything but hymns, no games or toys that might distract from our holy time. I grew up thinking this was normal, dear friends. I thought every Christian family lived this way. I thought every little girl spent her Saturdays listening to sermons about the end times, about the mark of the beast, about how Saturday was God's true Sabbath and those who worshipped on Sunday were deceived. The church was our entire social world. The families we knew, the children I played with, the adults who watched over me, they were all Adventists. Mrs. Henderson, who taught our Sabbath school class, would tell us stories about Daniel and the fiery furnace, about how God's faithful people always stood apart from the world. Mr. Carlson, the church treasurer, would count our tithe money with the solemnity of a sacred ritual. "Remember, children," Mrs. Henderson would say, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses, "we are God's remnant people. We have the truth that others don't understand yet." I believed every word. At 7, 8, 9 years old, I felt special knowing we had the truth. I felt sorry for the children in town who went to those other churches, the Methodists, the Baptists, the Catholics. They didn't know about the Sabbath. They didn't know about the three angels' messages. They didn't know that Jesus was coming back soon, maybe even before I grew up. Our daily routine centered around our faith. We had family worship every morning before school and every evening after dinner. My father would read from the Bible or Ellen White's writings. She was our prophetess, the woman who had received visions from God to guide the Seventh-day Adventist Church. My mother would lead us in songs, her fingers picking out melodies on our old upright piano. I learned to pray before I could properly tie my shoes. I memorized Bible verses before I memorized my multiplication tables. I could recite the 10 Commandments perfectly, emphasizing the fourth one about the Sabbath with special reverence. Every week, we looked forward to Sabbath. It began Friday evening with a special meal. My mother would light candles, and we'd have what we called Vespers, a time of family worship to welcome the Sabbath. Saturday morning meant church clothes pressed perfectly, hair braided tightly, and faces scrubbed until they shone. The church service followed a pattern I could recite in my sleep. Opening hymn, prayer, another hymn, children's story, offertory, sermon, closing hymn, benediction. Then potluck lunch in the fellowship hall, where all the families brought dishes to share. The adults would discuss the sermon while we children played quiet games, nothing too rowdy, nothing that would break the Sabbath peace. But it was during those afternoon meetings, those smaller gatherings in people's homes for Bible study, where the deeper teachings were shared. That's where they talked about prophecy, about the end times, about how our church was the only one teaching the full truth. That's where I first heard whispers about other churches being part of Babylon, about how we needed to be careful of false teachers and deceptive doctrines. The world doesn't understand us, Brother Johnson would say during those afternoon studies, his voice heavy with meaning. They think we're too strict, too different, but we must remember, we're not of this world. Those words echoed in my young mind. We weren't of this world. We were different. We were special. And that specialness came with rules, with boundaries, with a constant awareness that we were being watched, not just by our neighbors and our community, but by God Himself. As I grew older, approaching my teenage years, the weight of being different began to feel heavier. My schoolmates went to movies on Fridays, attended birthday parties on Saturdays, decorated Christmas trees in December. We did none of these things. They were worldly. They were pagan. They would separate us from God's people. But I was faithful. I was obedient. I was exactly the kind of young person the church loved to showcase as an example of proper Adventist upbringing. I had no idea that this very faithfulness, this very obedience, would soon make me vulnerable to someone who would use my trust for his own dark purposes. The first time I noticed Pastor Richard paying special attention to me, I was 14 years old. Pastor Richard Morrison arrived at Cedar Falls Seventh-day Adventist Church in the spring of 1973, when I was 15. He was 42 years old, tall and imposing, with silver streaking his dark hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. He had what people called presence. When he walked into a room, conversations stopped, and when he spoke, everyone listened. He came to us from the Iowa conference office, they said. A rising star in the denomination, a man destined for great things. He had degrees from Andrews University, the Adventist Seminary, and had written articles for the church publications. The search committee was thrilled to have attracted someone of his caliber to our small congregation of barely 100 members. Brother Morrison brings exactly the kind of spiritual leadership our young people need, announced Elder Patterson during the church business meeting where his hiring was approved unanimously. Pastor Richard had a wife, Linda, a quiet woman with brown hair always pulled back in a modest bun and dresses that never showed so much as an ankle. She played piano for the church services and taught the junior Sabbath school class, but she rarely spoke above a whisper. When she did speak, her eyes would dart quickly to her husband, as if seeking permission for every word. They had no children, which Pastor Richard explained as God's will for our ministry. He said it allowed them to focus entirely on the spiritual family God had given them, the church members. Looking back now, I wonder if Linda's silence and nervousness were signs I was too young to understand. Pastor Richard transformed our sleepy little church almost overnight. Attendance grew as he brought in families from neighboring towns who drove 30, 40 miles just to hear his preaching. His sermons were unlike anything we'd experienced before. Dramatic, intense, filled with vivid descriptions of end-time events and the persecution that awaited God's faithful people. "The time is short, dear saints," he would declare from the pulpit, his voice rising and falling like music. "Satan knows his time is running out, and he's working harder than ever to deceive God's people. We must be vigilant. We must be pure. We must be completely surrendered to God's will. He preached about the mark of the beast with such passion that people would leave church services genuinely frightened about the times ahead. He talked about Sunday laws coming soon, about Adventists being imprisoned for their faith, about the final test that would separate the faithful from the apostate. But it wasn't just his preaching that drew people. Pastor Richard had a gift for making each person feel special, chosen, important to God's work. He remembered everyone's name, their family situations, their spiritual struggles. He would stop by homes for impromptu visits, always bringing encouragement and spiritual counsel. With the teenagers especially, he seemed to have unlimited time and patience. He started a youth group that met Friday evenings before Sabbath began. We would gather in the church basement, 20 or so young people from ages 13 to 18, and Pastor Richard would teach us about prophecy, about our special role as young Adventists in the final generation. "You young people," he would say, looking directly at each of us, "you are the ones who will see Jesus come. You are the ones who must be ready to stand for truth when everyone else falls away." I lived for those Friday evening meetings. At 15, I was hungry for spiritual depth, for someone to take my faith seriously. My parents were good people, but their faith was simple, practical. Pastor Richard offered something more: mysteries, prophecies, the feeling that I was part of something cosmic and important. He began calling me Sister Evelyn during those meetings, even though I was just a teenager. The other kids he still called by their first names, but I was Sister Evelyn, as if I were already an adult member of the church community. The distinction made me feel mature, respected, chosen. "Sister Evelyn has such spiritual insight for someone so young," he announced one Friday evening after I had answered a question about the sanctuary service. "I believe God has special plans for her." Those words sent shivers down my spine. Good shivers at the time. To be noticed by Pastor Richard, to be called spiritually insightful, to be told God had special plans for me, it was everything a serious-minded Adventist teenager could want to hear. My parents were delighted with Pastor Richard's attention to my spiritual development. When he suggested I might benefit from individual Bible studies to prepare for baptism and church membership, they agreed enthusiastically. "Pastor Morrison sees something special in our Evelyn," my mother told my father that evening, not knowing I was listening from the kitchen. "He thinks she has real potential for ministry, maybe even missionary work." The idea of being missionary material thrilled me. I had grown up hearing stories of Adventist missionaries who gave their lives to spread the three angels' messages to the world. To think that Pastor Richard saw that potential in me was intoxicating. Our individual Bible studies began that autumn. Every Tuesday afternoon at 4 o'clock, I would walk from Cedar Falls High School to the church office for what Pastor Richard called discipleship training. The church building was always empty at that time. The secretary left at 3, and evening activities didn't begin until 7. We met in his private study, a small room behind the sanctuary filled with theological books, commentaries, and framed certificates from his seminary education. The walls were lined with volumes by Ellen White, and his desk was covered with sermon notes and conference reports. It smelled of old books and the coffee he constantly drank from a ceramic mug that read, "Maranatha." During those first few sessions, everything seemed perfectly appropriate. We studied baptismal vows, went through fundamental beliefs, discussed what it meant to be a Seventh-day Adventist. Pastor Richard was patient, thorough, encouraging. He answered my questions with detailed explanations and seemed genuinely pleased with my understanding. "You grasped these concepts so quickly, Sister Evelyn," he would say, leaning back in his chair with satisfaction. "Most young people your age struggle with the deeper aspects of our message, but you have a real gift for spiritual things." He began assigning me special readings, not just Bible texts, but specific chapters from Ellen White's books, articles from denominational publications, even some of his own sermon manuscripts. He said I needed more advanced spiritual nourishment than what was available in regular Sabbath school classes. "The regular church members," he confided during one of our sessions, "they mean well, but most of them are content with milk when God wants to give them meat. You're ready for the strong meat of the Word." I felt incredibly privileged. Here was this learned, respected pastor treating me like a spiritual equal, sharing insights he didn't give to others. When he spoke about the deeper truths that only mature Christians could handle, I felt chosen, special, trusted, with sacred knowledge. But gradually, subtly, the tone of our meetings began to change. The spiritual discussions started including more personal elements. Pastor Richard began asking about my home life, my relationship with my parents, my struggles with teenage emotions and doubts. True discipleship requires complete honesty, he explained, when I hesitated to share something personal. You can't grow spiritually if you're hiding parts of yourself from your spiritual father. The term spiritual father made me uncomfortable at first, but Pastor Richard explained it was biblical. Paul called Timothy his son in the faith. Elijah was like a father to Elisha. Spiritual mentorship required this kind of intimate, family-like relationship. Your parents love you, he said, but they can only guide you so far. They don't have the spiritual depth to prepare you for the challenges ahead. That's why God has brought us together, so I can help you become the woman of God He wants you to be. Looking back now, dear friends, I can see how carefully he was laying the groundwork, creating a special relationship that set him apart from all other authority figures in my life. But at 15, hungry for spiritual significance and desperately wanting to please God, I interpreted his attention as divine favor. The warning signs were there, but I didn't recognize them. The way he would lock his study door during our meetings, saying we needed privacy for spiritual discussions. The way he began sitting closer to me, occasionally touching my shoulder or hand while making a point. The way he started asking me not to discuss our conversations with my parents. They wouldn't understand the depth of what we're exploring, he explained. Most church members, even good ones like your parents, aren't ready for these advanced spiritual concepts. It might worry them unnecessarily. By winter of 1973, our Tuesday afternoon sessions had become the center of my week. I would count the days until our next meeting, prepare questions to ask, write down spiritual insights to share with Pastor Richard. He had become the most important person in my spiritual life, more important than my parents, more important than anyone. And that's exactly what he had planned. By the spring of 1974, something had fundamentally shifted in my relationship with Pastor Richard, though I couldn't articulate what it was at the time. Our Tuesday afternoon Bible studies had evolved into something that felt less like education and more like initiation. Into what, I wasn't sure, but the atmosphere in his study had grown heavy with unspoken expectations. Sister Evelyn, he said, during one particularly intense session in March, closing his Bible and leaning forward in his chair, I've been praying about your spiritual development, and God has shown me that you're ready for the next level of consecration. The way he said consecration made my stomach flutter with nervous excitement. In Adventist terminology, consecration meant complete surrender to God's will, total commitment to His service. It was what every serious believer aspired to achieve. What does that mean, Pastor? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He stood up and walked to his bookshelf, pulling out a leather-bound volume I'd never seen before. The title was worn, but I could make out the words, Sacred Mysteries, embossed in gold. There are truths, Sister Evelyn, that the general membership isn't ready to receive. Deep spiritual insights that can only be shared with those who have proven their complete loyalty to God's remnant church. He opened the book to a page marked with a red ribbon. The text was dense, theological, discussing what appeared to be advanced interpretations of prophetic symbols. But scattered throughout were references to spiritual submission, sacred relationships, and purification through intimate knowledge. The Apostle Paul spoke of mysteries hidden from the foundation of the world, Pastor Richard continued, his voice taking on that hypnotic quality I'd grown to associate with his most important teachings. Christ himself said he spoke in parables so that only those with ears to hear would understand. I felt privileged beyond measure. Here was Pastor Richard, this brilliant, spiritually mature leader, preparing to share sacred knowledge with me that he hadn't shared with anyone else in the congregation. Not even the church elders, he implied, were ready for these deeper truths. Over the following weeks, our sessions took on an almost ritualistic quality. Pastor Richard would begin each meeting by asking me to kneel while he offered a prayer for spiritual discernment. The prayers grew longer, more intense, often including requests for God to break down every barrier to complete surrender and to prepare this young vessel for sacred service. The physical positioning bothered me initially. Kneeling while he remained standing seemed to emphasize a power dynamic that felt uncomfortable. But when I mentioned this hesitation, Pastor Richard's response was swift and decisive. "Sister Evelyn," he said, his voice taking on a tone of gentle disappointment, "I'm surprised to hear resistance from someone I thought was truly surrendered to God's will. Humility is the foundation of all spiritual growth. If you can't humble yourself before your spiritual father, how will you ever learn to humble yourself before God?" The rebuke stung. The last thing I wanted was to disappoint Pastor Richard, or worse, to disappoint God. I had been raised to respect authority, to submit to church leadership, to never question those God had placed over me. My parents had always taught me that rebellion against spiritual authority was rebellion against God Himself. "I'm sorry, Pastor," I whispered, feeling tears threatening. "I don't want to be resistant. Please help me understand what God wants from me." His demeanor softened immediately, and he knelt beside me, placing his hand on my shoulder in what felt like fatherly comfort. "That's my faithful girl," he murmured. "I knew God hadn't made a mistake when He led me to choose you for this special preparation. You have such a teachable spirit." The term "choose you" resonated deeply. To be chosen by God, through Pastor Richard, for special spiritual service was everything I had dreamed of as a young Adventist. It validated every sacrifice my family had made for our faith, every time we had stood apart from the world because of our beliefs. But as April turned to May, the content of our sessions became increasingly disturbing, though Pastor Richard presented everything with such biblical authority that I struggled to trust my own discomfort. He began discussing what he called biblical intimacy between spiritual mentors and their disciples, citing examples from Scripture that seemed to support unusually close relationships. David and Jonathan had a covenant relationship that transcended normal friendship, he explained, opening his Bible to various passages. Ruth's devotion to Naomi went beyond family loyalty. These were sacred bonds, Sister Evelyn, relationships that the world wouldn't understand, but that God ordained for spiritual purposes. He showed me texts about submission, about the necessity of complete trust between spiritual father and spiritual daughter, about how God sometimes called His people to relationships that appeared unconventional to carnal minds. The Apostle Paul was unmarried, Pastor Richard noted, but he had deep, intimate spiritual relationships with many of the women in the early church. Phoebe, Priscilla, even young women like the daughters of Philip who were prophetesses. These weren't inappropriate relationships, they were sacred partnerships in God's work. The theological framework he constructed was sophisticated, internally consistent, and presented with such conviction that my 16-year-old mind struggled to find flaws in his reasoning. He would cite Ellen White's writings about the necessity of complete submission to spiritual authority, about how God's remnant people must be willing to follow His leading, even when it seemed strange to human wisdom. But my body was sending signals my mind couldn't yet interpret. Every Tuesday, as 4 o'clock approached, I would feel a knot forming in my stomach. During our sessions, I found myself holding my breath, my muscles tense, my heart racing in a way that didn't feel like spiritual excitement. The breaking point came in late May, during what Pastor Richard announced would be a special consecration ceremony to mark my transition into advanced discipleship. He had prepared his study differently that day. The blinds were drawn, creating an atmosphere of intimate secrecy, and he had lit several candles, saying they represented the light of sacred knowledge being passed from mentor to disciple. "Sister Evelyn," he began, his voice more solemn than I'd ever heard it, "today marks a sacred threshold in your spiritual journey. What we're about to do is holy, ordained by God, and must never be spoken of to anyone who wouldn't understand its sacred nature." The phrasing sent alarm bells ringing in my mind, though I couldn't articulate why. Everything he said was wrapped in biblical language, presented as spiritual truth, supported by carefully selected scripture passages. But something deep inside me, some instinct I didn't even know I possessed, was screaming warnings. "Pastor," I said hesitantly, "what exactly are we going to do?" His eyes flashed with something I couldn't identify. Irritation? Impatience? But his voice remained gentle, paternal. "We're going to seal our spiritual covenant, Sister Evelyn. The way David and Jonathan sealed theirs, the way Ruth committed herself to Naomi, the way the early disciples consecrated themselves to their spiritual fathers. He moved closer, and I instinctively stepped backward, bumping against his desk. The movement was unconscious, but it clearly annoyed him. "Sister Evelyn," he said, his voice taking on that disappointed tone I'd learned to dread. "I thought we had moved beyond these carnal hesitations. This resistance you're showing, it's not from God. It's from the enemy, trying to prevent you from receiving the spiritual blessing God wants to give you." The accusation that my discomfort was demonic manipulation hit me like a physical blow. In Adventist theology, Satan was constantly working to deceive and destroy God's people. If Pastor Richard was right, if my hesitation was actually spiritual rebellion disguised as prudence, then I was in terrible danger. "I don't want to resist God," I whispered, tears starting to flow. I'm scared, Pastor. I don't understand what's happening." "Fear is not from God," he replied, opening his Bible to familiar passages about perfect love casting out fear. "Fear is Satan's tool to keep you from experiencing God's fullness. Trust me, Sister Evelyn. Trust the spiritual authority God has placed over you." But even as he spoke those words, another voice, quiet but persistent, was rising in my consciousness. It was asking questions I'd never thought to ask before. Why did spiritual consecration require secrecy? Why couldn't my parents be involved in such an important step in my spiritual journey? Why did everything about this feel wrong, even when it was explained with such biblical authority? "Pastor," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice, "I think I need to talk to my parents about this. They should know about whatever this special consecration involves." The mask slipped for just a moment. Pastor Richard's face darkened with undisguised anger before he quickly composed himself back into spiritual authority. "Sister Evelyn," he said, his voice now carrying a subtle threat, "I'm very disappointed in you. After all the time I've invested in your spiritual development, after all the special attention and advanced teaching I've shared with you, this is how you respond? With suspicion and rebellion?" He moved to his desk and began gathering up the materials from our sessions, the special books, the notes, the biblical passages he'd compiled specifically for my training. "I think," he said slowly, deliberately, "that you're not as spiritually mature as I believed. Perhaps you need more time with the general membership, more time in basic spiritual disciplines, before you're ready for advanced truth." The threat was unmistakable. All the special attention, all the privileges, all the spiritual significance I'd found in being chosen for advanced discipleship, it could all be taken away. I would go back to being just another teenager in the youth group, no longer special, no longer chosen, no longer important to God's work. But something stronger than the fear of losing my special status was rising inside me. A voice that had been whispering for weeks was finally strong enough to be heard clearly, and that voice was saying, "Run." "Pastor," I said, moving toward the door, "I think I need to pray about all this. I need to make sure I'm really hearing God's voice and not making a mistake." I reached for the door handle, and for one terrifying moment, I thought he might try to stop me physically, but he didn't. Instead, he spoke words that would haunt me for years. "Sister Evelyn," he said quietly, "if you walk out that door, if you choose doubt over faith, suspicion over trust, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. You'll never have another opportunity like this. God doesn't offer his special blessings twice to those who reject them the first time." But I opened the door anyway, and as I walked down the church hallway toward the exit, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand, I heard him call after me. "And Sister Evelyn, if you even think about repeating our private conversations to anyone, remember that no one will believe a confused teenage girl over a respected pastor. You'll only embarrass yourself and damage the church's ministry." I ran home that afternoon faster than I'd ever run in my life, but I couldn't outrun the questions that were multiplying in my mind with every step. What had just happened? What had Pastor Richard been trying to do? And most frightening of all, how many other young women in our church had been through similar advanced discipleship sessions? The answers to those questions would change everything I believed about my church, my faith, and the men I'd been taught to trust without question. That evening, I sat in my bedroom staring at the pink floral wallpaper my mother had hung when I was 12, trying to make sense of what had happened in Pastor Richard's study. My hands were still shaking, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just escaped something terrible, though I couldn't name exactly what. The next morning was Wednesday, which meant evening prayer meeting at church. For the first time in my life, I told my parents I didn't feel well enough to attend. The thought of seeing Pastor Richard, of sitting in that sanctuary where he preached about purity and righteousness, made my stomach lurch. "Are you sure you're all right, honey?" my mother asked, pressing her cool hand against my forehead. "You've been so excited about your Bible studies with Pastor Morrison. I thought you'd want to see him tonight." The innocent mention of Pastor Richard's name sent a chill through me. How could I explain to my sweet, trusting mother that the man she revered as God's servant had just tried to... what? I still couldn't fully comprehend what had almost happened. "I just need to rest, Mom," I whispered, pulling my blanket up to my chin. But I couldn't rest. As the hours passed, questions multiplied like weeds in my mind. Had I misunderstood Pastor Richard's intentions? Was I being paranoid, seeing evil where none existed? The possibility that I had wrongly accused a man of God, even in my own thoughts, terrified me almost as much as the possibility that I had been right to run. Thursday morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was helping my mother hang laundry on the line behind our house when I saw Jenny Patterson walking up our gravel driveway. Jenny was 18, a senior at Cedar Falls High, and one of the most dedicated young people in our church. If anyone could help me make sense of my confusion, it would be Jenny. "Hi, Mrs. Miller," Jenny called to my mother. "Could I talk to Evelyn for a few minutes?" My mother smiled and waved us toward the porch swing, continuing with her laundry. Jenny's face was serious as we sat down together, and I noticed she kept glancing around, as if making sure we weren't overheard. "Evelyn," she said quietly, "I heard that Pastor Morrison has been giving you private Bible studies." I nodded, suddenly alert. There was something in Jenny's tone that made my chest tighten. Has he talked to you about special spiritual relationships? About advanced discipleship that has to be kept secret?" The questions hit me like physical blows. Jenny knew. Somehow she knew exactly what had been happening in those Tuesday afternoon sessions. "Jenny," I whispered, "how do you know about that?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked away toward the cornfield beyond our property line. "Because he did the same thing to me last year," she said so quietly I almost couldn't hear her. "And to Sarah Whitman the year before that, and probably to others we don't even know about." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Sarah Whitman had been one of our youth group members who had suddenly stopped attending church the previous spring. When people asked where she was, Pastor Richard had sadly announced that she had been led astray by worldly influences and was no longer walking with God. "But Sarah was so faithful," I said, my voice barely functioning. "She loved the church. She wanted to be a missionary." "She was faithful," Jenny replied, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Too faithful, just like you, just like me. That's what he looks for, Evelyn. Girls who are serious about their faith, who trust church authority, who won't question what he tells them." The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. The special attention, the advanced spiritual teachings, the emphasis on secrecy, the gradual isolation from parents and other authority figures. It was all part of a pattern. "What did you do?" I asked. "When you realized what was happening." Jenny was quiet for a long moment, watching a red-winged blackbird perch on our fence post. "I should have run sooner than I did," she said finally. "But he's very convincing, Evelyn. He makes you feel so special, so chosen. And when you start to have doubts, he makes you feel like the doubts are your own spiritual weakness." She turned to look at me directly, her eyes intense with urgency. "But you ran, didn't you? Yesterday. Something happened, and you got out of there." I nodded, still not trusting my voice to describe what had almost occurred in Pastor Richard's study. "Good girl," Jenny said, squeezing my hand. "That took more courage than you know." "But Jenny," I said, voicing the fear that had been plaguing me all night. "What if we're wrong? What if he really is trying to help us spiritually and we just don't understand? What if we're the ones with impure minds?" Jenny's laugh was bitter. "That's exactly what he wants us to think, Evelyn. That's how he keeps us quiet. He makes us believe that if we question him, we're questioning God himself." She stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, her voice gaining strength. But I've been reading my Bible more carefully this year, studying without his interpretations filtering everything. And you know what I've discovered? Nothing, absolutely nothing in Scripture supports what he was trying to do with us. Real spiritual mentorship doesn't require secrecy. Real discipleship doesn't isolate you from your family. Real spiritual authority doesn't make you feel dirty and confused. Her words resonated with something deep inside me, something that had been trying to surface during all those uncomfortable Tuesday afternoons. We have to tell someone, I said suddenly. If he's done this to you and Sarah and maybe others, we can't let him keep doing it. Jenny's face went pale. Tell who, Evelyn? He's the pastor. He's respected by everyone in the church. The elders think he's wonderful. Your parents think he's wonderful. My parents think he's wonderful. Who's going to believe two teenage girls against a man with seminary degrees and conference recommendations? The reality of our situation hit me like a cold wave. In our church culture, questioning pastoral authority was almost unthinkable. Pastors were God's appointed shepherds. They were to be honored, obeyed, supported. The idea that one of them could be a predator was so foreign to our community's worldview that even suggesting it would be seen as rebellion or delusion. But we have to try, I insisted. We can't just let this continue. Jenny studied my face for a long moment. Are you sure you're ready for what that means, Evelyn? Are you ready to lose your church family? Because that's what will happen. They'll either say we're lying, or they'll say we somehow brought it on ourselves, or they'll find some way to make it our fault. And even if some people believe us, they'll want to handle it quietly to protect the church's reputation. He'll be transferred to another conference, and we'll be the troublemakers who cause division in the body of Christ. The weight of what she was describing felt crushing. To lose our church family would mean losing everything. Our community, our identity, our understanding of our place in God's plan. For young people raised in insular religious communities, the prospect of being cut off from that world was terrifying. But as I sat there on my parents' porch, watching my mother hang my father's work shirts on the line with such care and devotion, I thought about other mothers and fathers in our church, parents who trusted Pastor Richard with their daughters, parents who were probably encouraging their teenage girls to take advantage of his spiritual mentorship, just as mine had done. Jenny, I said, my voice stronger now, what if one of those other girls doesn't run? What if she trusts him completely and doesn't have the instinct to get away? Jenny's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they looked like tears of resolve rather than despair. You're right, she whispered. We can't let that happen. So what do? Jenny was quiet for several minutes, thinking. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and determined. We talk to our parents first, together, tonight. We tell them everything, and we ask them to go with us to the church board. If the board won't listen, we go to the conference. If the conference won't listen, we go to the police. The plan terrified me, but it also filled me with something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Hope that the truth could prevail, hope that justice was possible, hope that other young women could be protected. Okay, I said, let's do it. That evening, in my family's living room, with my parents and Jenny's parents gathered around, we told our stories. The telling was harder than I had imagined. Seeing the shock and pain in my parents' faces as they realized what had been happening under their noses was almost unbearable. Why didn't you tell us sooner? My mother asked, tears streaming down her cheeks. Because he made us believe it was spiritual, I replied. He made us believe that questioning him was the same as questioning God. My father, who rarely showed strong emotion, was white with rage. That man, he said through gritted teeth, used our faith against us. He used our children's devotion to God to manipulate them. Within an hour, we were walking up the steps of Elder Patterson's house, our small group united in purpose despite our fear. The confrontation that followed would change our church, our community, and our lives forever. But for the first time since those Tuesday afternoon sessions had begun, I felt like I was on the side of truth. Elder Patterson answered his door that evening with the warm smile he always wore for church members, but his expression quickly shifted to concern when he saw our somber group gathered on his front porch. Brother Miller, Sister Miller, he said, nodding to my parents, then to Jenny's family. "What brings you all here tonight? Is everything all right?" My father, usually a man of few words, took a deep breath before responding. "Harold, we need to talk to you about Pastor Morrison. Something serious has come to light, and we need the church board's immediate attention." Elder Patterson's face grew cautious. In our small Adventist community, challenging pastoral authority was virtually unthinkable. He invited us into his living room, where family photos lined the mantelpiece, and Ellen White's books sat prominently on the coffee table. "What seems to be the concern?" he asked, settling into his recliner while the rest of us arranged ourselves on his couch and dining room chairs. Jenny and I exchanged glances, and she nodded for me to begin. My voice trembled as I started recounting the Tuesday afternoon sessions, the gradual progression from normal Bible study to something that felt increasingly wrong. Elder Patterson listened without interruption, his face growing more troubled with each detail. When I finished describing what had happened in Pastor Richard's study just 2 days earlier, Elder Patterson was quiet for a long moment. Then Jenny spoke up, sharing her own experience from the previous year. The similarities were unmistakable. The same pattern, the same manipulation tactics, the same use of biblical language to justify inappropriate behavior. "Girls," Elder Patterson said finally, his voice heavy with something between disbelief and reluctance, "these are very serious accusations you're making. Pastor Morrison is a respected minister, a graduate of Andrews University. Are you absolutely certain you didn't misunderstand his intentions?" The question hit me like a slap. Even now, even with two of us sharing nearly identical experiences, the default assumption was that we must be mistaken. "Brother Patterson," my father interjected, his voice tight with controlled anger, "my daughter doesn't lie. And the fact that both girls have such similar stories suggests something deeply troubling is happening." Of course," Elder Patterson said quickly. "I'm not suggesting the girls are lying. I'm just trying to understand exactly what occurred. Sometimes young people can misinterpret adult intentions, especially in spiritual matters they might not fully comprehend." Jenny's father, who had been silent until now, leaned forward in his chair. "Harold, would you be comfortable with Pastor Morrison conducting these same advanced Bible studies with your granddaughter, behind locked doors, with instructions not to tell her parents about the content?" The directness of the question seemed to penetrate Elder Patterson's defenses. He looked genuinely shaken for the first time since we'd arrived. "No," he admitted quietly. "I wouldn't be comfortable with that." "Then you understand our concern," my mother said, her voice steady despite the tears that had been flowing intermittently all evening. "These girls trusted him because we taught them to trust pastoral authority. He exploited that trust." Elder Patterson stood and walked to his window, looking out at the darkness that had settled over Cedar Falls. When he turned back to us, his face reflected the weight of what he was being asked to confront. "If what you're telling me is true," he said slowly, "then we have a crisis on our hands. But I can't make a decision of this magnitude alone. We need to call an emergency meeting of the church board." He walked to his telephone and began making calls. Within an hour, 5 of the 7 board members had gathered in Elder Patterson's living room. The missing 2 were out of town, but those present represented the core leadership of our congregation. The board members, all men in their 50s and 60s, all lifelong Adventists, listened to our testimonies with expressions ranging from shock to skepticism to barely concealed anger. Not anger at Pastor Richard, but anger at the situation, at being forced to confront something that threatened their understanding of church order and pastoral integrity. Elder Johnson, the church treasurer, was the first to voice what several others were clearly thinking. "Brother Patterson, I've known Richard Morrison for 3 years now. He's brought tremendous spiritual growth to our congregation. Our membership has increased by 30% since he arrived. His sermons are powerful, his pastoral care exemplary. These accusations, they just don't align with the man I know." "That's exactly what makes predators effective," Jenny said, her voice stronger than I'd heard it all evening. "They're charming, respected, above suspicion. If Pastor Morrison were obviously creepy or inappropriate, he wouldn't have been able to get close to us in the first place." Elder Wright, the head deacon, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Young lady, You're talking about a serious criminal accusation against a minister of the gospel. We can't just take the word of confused teenagers against a man with his credentials and reputation." The dismissive tone in his voice ignited something fierce in my father. "Those confused teenagers are our daughters, Brother Wright. They've been raised in this church, taught to honor truth and honesty. When they tell us that a pastor has manipulated and attempted to abuse them, we believe them." "But what proof do we have?" Elder Martinez asked. "It's their word against his. In situations like this, we need to be very careful about destroying a man's ministry based on accusations that might be misunderstandings." The conversation continued for another hour, with board members raising concern after concern about taking action against Pastor Richard. They worried about church unity, about their reputation in the community, about the legal implications of confronting a pastor without concrete evidence. But gradually, as Jenny and I answered their questions with consistency and detail, providing specific dates, times, and conversations that would be impossible to fabricate, the mood in the room began to shift. The biblical language Pastor Richard had used, the progression of his manipulation tactics, the way he had isolated us from our families. The pattern was too specific, too calculated to be coincidental. Elder Patterson finally called for a decision. "Brothers, we have two choices. We can ignore these testimonies and hope they're mistaken, which puts other young women at risk. Or we can investigate thoroughly and take appropriate action if we find evidence of wrongdoing." The vote was close, 4-3 in favor of investigating. Elder Johnson, Elder Wright, and Elder Martinez voted against, clearly hoping the whole situation would somehow disappear. "Very well," Elder Patterson said. "Tomorrow morning, I'll contact the Iowa Conference office and report what we've learned. They'll advise us on proper procedures." But as we were preparing to leave, Elder Johnson made one final comment that chilled me to the bone. "I hope you all understand that if these accusations prove unfounded, there will be serious consequences for making false charges against a minister. The Bible is very clear about bearing false witness." The threat was unmistakable. If we couldn't prove our case beyond doubt, we would be branded as liars and troublemakers. The next 3 days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and mounting tension. The Iowa Conference initially responded with skepticism, echoing the concerns we'd heard from our own board members. Pastor Richard, when finally confronted, denied everything categorically and expressed hurt surprise that anyone would believe such accusations against him. "I've only tried to provide spiritual guidance to these young women," he told the conference officials who came to investigate. "If they misinterpreted my pastoral care as something inappropriate, that speaks to their own spiritual immaturity, not to any wrongdoing on my part." It was a masterful defense, acknowledging the girls' claims while reframing them as misunderstandings, positioning himself as the wounded party, and subtly suggesting that we were spiritually deficient for misinterpreting his intentions. But then something unexpected happened. Word of the investigation had somehow leaked, and on Friday evening, Jenny received a phone call that would change everything. "Jenny?" The voice was hesitant, scared. "This is Rebecca Carlson. I heard about what happened with Pastor Morrison, and I need to tell you something." Rebecca was 19, a young woman who had graduated from our church school 2 years earlier and now worked as a secretary in town. She had been one of Pastor Richard's success stories, a dedicated young Adventist who seemed to embody everything the church wanted in its youth. "What is it, Rebecca?" Jenny asked, her heart racing. "He did things to me too," Rebecca whispered. 2 years ago, when I was 17. But he went further than what you described, and I was too ashamed to tell anyone because he convinced me it was my fault, that I had tempted him." Jenny's hands were shaking as she took down Rebecca's phone number and promised to call her back. Within an hour, we had contacted the conference officials and arranged for Rebecca to share her testimony. Rebecca's account was devastating. She described a pattern of abuse that had escalated over months, always presented in spiritual terms, always accompanied by threats about what would happen if she told anyone. She had physical evidence, a journal she had kept, documenting dates and incidents, trying to understand what was happening to her. Most damaging of all, she had a letter Pastor Richard had written to her, supposedly a spiritual instruction, but containing language that was unmistakably grooming and manipulation. With Rebecca's testimony and evidence, the conference's attitude shifted dramatically. A formal investigation was launched, and Pastor Richard was immediately suspended from all ministerial duties pending the outcome. The church was in upheaval. Some members rallied to Pastor Richard's defense, insisting that he was being persecuted by false accusations. Others, as details emerged, began to see the truth of what had been happening under their noses. My family and Jenny's family found ourselves at the center of a storm that divided our congregation. Anonymous letters appeared in our mailboxes, some supportive, others accusing us of destroying the church and attacking God's servant. But we also heard from other families, quietly sharing concerns they had harbored but never voiced. Parents who had felt uneasy about Pastor Richard's special attention to their daughters. Church members who had noticed patterns but had dismissed their concerns as uncharitable thoughts about a man of God. The investigation took 6 weeks. During that time, 2 more young women came forward with similar experiences. The evidence became overwhelming, undeniable. Pastor Richard was defrocked, his ministerial credentials permanently revoked. He left Cedar Falls in the middle of the night, his wife Linda following him to whatever new life they would attempt to build far from the ruins of his ministry. The church was left to heal from wounds we were only beginning to understand. Some families left our congregation entirely, unable to process what had happened or blaming those of us who had spoken out for destroying their faith community. But others stayed, committed to rebuilding our church on a foundation of truth and transparency rather than blind deference to authority. For me, at 16, the experience had shattered some illusions but had also revealed something precious. The truth, no matter how painful, was always worth fighting for. 50 years have passed since that terrible spring of 1974, and I'm now 67 years old, sitting in my small apartment in Portland, Oregon, watching the morning sunlight filter through my kitchen window as I share this story with you. The woman who ran from Pastor Richard's study that Tuesday afternoon feels like both a stranger and the most familiar person in the world to me. The immediate aftermath of Pastor Richard's removal was harder than I had anticipated. Our little church in Cedar Falls never fully recovered from the scandal. Within 2 years, attendance had dropped by half. Some families moved away entirely, seeking fresh starts in communities where their children wouldn't be known as those girls who accused the pastor. Others simply drifted away from organized religion altogether, their faith too damaged to continue. My own family stayed in Cedar Falls, but our relationship with the Seventh-day Adventist Church became complicated. My parents, bless their hearts, never wavered in their support of Jenny and me, but they struggled to reconcile their faith in God with their shattered trust in religious institutions. How could we have been so blind? My mother would ask herself repeatedly during those difficult months. How could we have sent our daughter into that man's office and never questioned what was happening? I watched my father age years in a matter of months. He had been a deacon, a man who took pride in his service to the church, and the knowledge that he had unknowingly facilitated a predator's access to young women ate at him like a cancer. The Iowa conference handled the situation with typical institutional damage control. They issued a carefully worded statement about taking allegations seriously while emphasizing that Pastor Richard's actions didn't reflect the character of the Seventh-day Adventist ministry as a whole. No apology was offered to his victims. No systemic changes were implemented to prevent similar situations. Most painfully, several conference officials suggested privately that our families bore some responsibility for what had happened. We should have been more vigilant, they implied. We should have asked more questions about those private Bible studies. The victim blaming was subtle, but unmistakable. Jenny and I remained close friends through high school, bonded by our shared experience, but also by our determination not to let it define us. We both struggled with trust issues, particularly regarding male authority figures. We both had periods of deep doubt about our faith, wondering if the corruption we'd witnessed was indicative of something rotten at the core of organized religion. But we also discovered something powerful. Speaking truth, even when it costs everything, creates a kind of freedom that can't be taken away. Jenny went on to become a social worker, specializing in helping children who had experienced abuse. She married a kind man who understood her history and supported her mission to protect vulnerable people. They had 3 children and raised them with the kind of open communication and healthy boundaries that our generation had never known. I took a different path. The experience with Pastor Richard had opened my eyes to the ways religious authority could be manipulated and abused, and I became fascinated with the psychology of power and control. I earned a degree in psychology, then a master's in religious studies, spending my career researching and writing about spiritual abuse in religious communities. My work has taken me to conferences around the world where I've met survivors from every imaginable religious background. Catholic priests who abused altar boys, Protestant pastors who manipulated young women, cult leaders who controlled every aspect of their followers' lives. The details vary, but the patterns are remarkably consistent across cultures and denominations. The tools predators use are universal: isolation from support systems, creation of special spiritual relationships that must be kept secret, use of religious language to normalize inappropriate behavior, and threats about spiritual consequences for those who resist or speak out. What I've learned is that spiritual abuse thrives in environments where questioning authority is discouraged, where leaders are elevated beyond accountability, and where the institution's reputation is prioritized over individual safety. Unfortunately, these conditions exist in many religious communities, making them hunting grounds for predators who understand how to exploit faith for personal gain. Over the decades, I've received hundreds of letters and emails from survivors sharing their own stories. Women who were abused by youth pastors, seminary professors, church elders. Men who were victimized by religious leaders when they were vulnerable teenagers or young adults. Parents who discovered their children had been harmed by trusted spiritual authorities. Each story breaks my heart anew, but they also reinforce my conviction that speaking out, despite the personal cost, was the right choice. Every time a survivor finds the courage to break their silence, they potentially save others from experiencing the same trauma. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, like many religious institutions, has made some progress in recent decades regarding abuse prevention and response. They've implemented background checks for those working with children, established clearer policies about appropriate boundaries between ministers and congregants, and created systems for reporting suspected abuse. But the fundamental problems remain largely unaddressed. Religious authority is still often treated as beyond question. Institutional reputation is still frequently prioritized over victim welfare. And the theological frameworks that predators exploit, concepts of submission, spiritual authority, and divine calling, remain largely unchallenged. Rebecca, the young woman whose courageous testimony had been instrumental in exposing Pastor Richard's pattern of abuse, became a victim advocate and eventually a lawyer specializing in cases involving religious institutions. She and I have maintained contact over the years, and she's often told me that sharing her story, despite the pain it caused, was one of the most important things she ever did. Every time I help another survivor find justice, she told me during a recent phone call, I think about that scared 19-year-old girl who almost stayed silent forever. Speaking up saved not just the women who might have been Richard's future victims, but it saved me too. It gave meaning to my suffering. The ripple effects of our decision to confront Pastor Richard extended far beyond our small congregation in Cedar Falls. The story was picked up by denominational publications, sparking conversations about ministerial accountability that had been long overdue. Other survivors in different churches found courage to share their own experiences, leading to additional investigations and removals. Not all of those cases resulted in justice. Some predators were simply transferred to different conferences or different roles. Some victims were silenced by legal threats or community pressure. But seeds of change were planted, and slowly, incrementally, religious communities began to acknowledge that spiritual authority could be corrupted and that victims deserve to be believed and protected. My own faith journey has been complex and sometimes painful. I never completely abandoned my belief in God, but I did abandon my belief in religious institutions as reliable conduits for divine truth. I learned to distinguish between spirituality and religion, between genuine faith and institutional control. I've attended many different churches over the years, sometimes as a worshiper, sometimes as a researcher, always with the critical eye of someone who has seen behind the curtain. I've met wonderful, genuine spiritual leaders who use their authority to serve and protect. I've also encountered more predators, more systems designed to silence inconvenient truths, more communities where appearance matters more than reality. What sustains me is the knowledge that truth has its own power. When Jenny and I stood up in that church board meeting 50 years ago, we had nothing but our stories and our conviction that what had happened to us was wrong. We faced an entire system designed to discredit and silence us. But truth has a way of surfacing, even when powerful forces try to bury it. Today, at 67, I live quietly but purposefully. I volunteer with organizations that support abuse survivors. I mentor young researchers studying religious trauma. I continue to write and speak about the importance of accountability in religious communities. I never married or had children, partly by choice, and partly because the trust issues from my teenage trauma took decades to fully address. But I've had a rich life filled with meaningful relationships and important work. I've traveled the world, earned multiple degrees, published books that have helped countless survivors understand their experiences. Most importantly, I've never regretted the decision to speak truth to power that spring evening in 1974. It cost me my childhood church community and forced me to rebuild my understanding of faith from the ground up. But it also taught me that courage is contagious, that justice is possible, and that ordinary people can challenge corrupt systems when they stand together. The letter I keep framed on my desk is from a young woman named Sarah, not the Sarah Whitman from my church, but another Sarah, writing from across the country. She had read one of my articles about spiritual abuse and found the courage to report her own youth pastor's inappropriate behavior. "Because you spoke up 50 years ago," she wrote, "I knew I had the right to speak up too. Because you showed that teenage girls could be believed, I knew I could be believed. Your courage echoed across 5 decades and gave me permission to find my own voice. This is the miracle of truth-telling, dear friends. It echoes across generations, creating space for other voices, other survivors, other truth-tellers. Every time someone chooses courage over comfort, honesty over reputation, protection of the vulnerable over preservation of the powerful, they make it easier for the next person to make the same choice." As I finish sharing this story with you, I want to leave you with this thought. If you're watching this video and you recognize elements of your own experience in what I've shared, please know that you're not alone. Your instincts about inappropriate behavior are probably correct. Your discomfort with secrecy and isolation is justified. Your right to safety and dignity is non-negotiable, regardless of who is violating it or what religious language they use to justify their actions. And if you're in a position of authority, whether in a church, a family, or any other institution, please remember that power is a sacred trust. Use it to protect the vulnerable, not to exploit them. Create transparency, not secrecy. Foster healthy boundaries, not inappropriate intimacy. The truth may hurt temporarily, but lies destroy permanently. Choose truth. Choose courage. Choose the protection of the innocent over the preservation of institutions. This is a real story, shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with it. If you also have a story you'd like to share, please write in the comments. We would be very happy to tell your story on our channel.